All right, let's discuss ATP a little bit. ATP is probably one of the most important molecules in living organisms. It is essential for getting work done. It's essential for basically making the processes of life happen, whether it's in the cell, it's on the level of a muscle, or in the organism. And that's true for plants, animals, fungi, any of the living organisms in any of the kingdoms. They all use ATP, even bacteria do. All right, so ATP is not as exotic and foreign as we might expect. It's actually very similar to DNA or RNA more specifically. It's got a ribose, it's got an adenine nitrogenous base, and it's got 3 phosphates. So the difference here is that there's 3 phosphates instead of just 1 phosphate in a nucleotide of DNA or RNA. But other than that, quite similar. So let's take a look at that structure. We recognize the pentose right here. In this case, it's ribose, like RNA. We see the nitrogenous base that happens to be the purine adenine, exactly the same one that you see in RNA and DNA, identical. You don't need to know about the detailed structure. We just learned that it's a 2-ring structure. You don't need to worry about the carbons and nitrogens there. But obviously, because it's a nitrogenous base, it's going to have nitrogen. And then we have 3 phosphates. Those 3 phosphates are all stuck together. Now, the phosphates have negative charges on those oxygens, all these O minuses. Negative charges repel each other because likes repel. And that makes this triple phosphate setup basically like a compressed spring, which gives it a lot of energy. There's a lot of energy basically stored, potential energy stored in these 3 phosphates stuck together. And that's also the reason it's called ATP, because it's adenosine triphosphate. Tri obviously referring to the 3. This structure is a little bit more reasonable for us to be able to draw. So if you could draw this, you could even put a little O in here to show that that's a ribose, not just a carbon ring. That's a lot simpler. When ATP gives up its energy and it donates its energy to some kind of a process, it will release one of the phosphates. Usually it releases 1. Sometimes it actually releases 2, but in most cases it releases 1. And then it goes from ATP to form ADP plus PI. So the I is just inorganic phosphate. It just means the phosphate is not stuck to a carbon molecule. That's all. It's just a free-floating phosphate, like the kind you're going to learn about in chemistry, or you already learned in chem if you're a senior. All right, so the ADP is low energy. ATP is high energy. The low energy ADP has to get recharged, and that's what we're going to do in the mitochondria. Mitochondria are going to take that and shove a phosphate back on there and turn it back into ATP with the energy that we get from food. That's the reason we have to eat food. All right, so here's a somewhat complicated example of one of the ways that ATP can help the cell get things done. We're going to take a look at the conversion of glutamic acid to glutamine. So 2 different amino acids, one can get converted into the other. The only difference between the 2 is that glutamine has this amine group stuck up here, the nitrogen, making it glutamine. So it's got the glutamic acid down here, the triangle here, and then that extra nitrogen makes it glutamine. All right, so that's an important reaction that happens in cells when glutamine is needed, that one can be converted to the other. But because we're creating a larger molecule, we have to put energy in. So the ammonia doesn't just want to stick on there spontaneously. It takes effort to get it to stick on there. It doesn't just want to happen. Even with the presence of an enzyme, it takes energy to do it. So to get that done, ATP is going to essentially energize the glutamic acid molecule by sticking a phosphate on it. So this phosphate makes that glutamic acid molecule high energy. So normally the glutamic acid would be at a low energy state all the way down here at the bottom of the hill. Once ATP adds a phosphate, it shoves it all the way up the hill. Now it's stuck up here with a lot of energy. To go from this state, this high energy state, to the glutamine state, it's actually going to go downhill now. It's going to like roll down the hill to this state right here, where it's kind of sort of intermediate in between. So the ATP lifted it all the way up the hill, gave it more energy than it even needed, and then it was able to fall back down to the state that it needed to be at, which is glutamine. This basically does the math for us here. We don't need to worry about this too much, but notice that the delta G is negative, which means it's going to be spontaneous. In the end, it's going to be a downhill reaction. All right, here's some other kinds of things that ATP can help with. So it isn't just always building or destroying. Sometimes it's movement. So here on the top we have movement of molecules across a membrane, like the sodium-potassium pump, for example, where we're pumping sodium out of the cell, and we might be pumping potassium in. In order to do that, it's going to take ATP. ATP is going to make that happen. Another example of movement where ATP is responsible for causing some kind of motion is motor proteins. This is a motor protein that's called kinesin. And kinesin can walk along a microtubule, which is part of the cytoskeleton in a cell. And each step that the little kinesin guy takes requires one ATP. And it might be moving, let's say, a vesicle full of some kind of substance from one part of the cell to the other. All right, so the movement of this molecule and moving things around in the cell is accomplished via ATP. By the way, the movement of our muscles, so that allows us to walk or move our arms or talk or anything like that, also is accomplished with ATP, as you might have expected, because I've been telling you ATP is really important and does just about everything. Sometimes I say the quote, everything we do with ATP, and that's basically 99% correct. There's some other molecules also important, but ATP is the most important one. So I'll show you this motor protein real quickly. Let's see if we can get YouTube to work here. So this is a nice example of that little motor protein. It's obviously an animation walking along this microtubule. So here we have the microtubule. I don't think I can draw on this. Yeah, no, I can't draw on this. But here's the microtubule. This is the big vesicle full of stuff, and this is the motor protein guy taking steps along the microtubule. Each step that he takes an ATP. Step, step, step. Each time an ATP is consumed. All right, ATP then needs to be regenerated, which we talked about happens in the mitochondria. So we then, in mitochondria, go from ADP to ATP. And we do that with food energy. It's a little more complicated than that, but we'll talk about the details on that later. All right, so this just kind of summarizes the whole thing, that catabolic reactions, like basically, digesting food or breaking down food molecules, allows us to take ADP and go to ATP. And then when we go from ATP to ADP, we get work done. So this does work for us, and it just keeps getting recycled. The same molecules keep getting used and spent and then recharged and spent over and over. We don't make brand new ATP every time. We use that same ADP and just stick a phosphate back on it.